A millionaire is violently pushed off a 10-story building, but a poor 7-year-old girl rushes to help him. However, she was too weak to bear his weight. What happens next is unbelievable. The storm building over New York City was a pale reflection of the fury boiling in Arthur Sterling's chest. From the top of his penthouse, the world looked like a chessboard at his feet, a domain he had shaped with an iron fist and a suspicion that was both his armor and his curse. The air inside the office, thick with the scent of Italian leather and power, was charged with the kind of electricity that precedes lightning. Across the polished mahogany desk, Richard Price, the man he had once called a brother and who was now just an obstacle, trembled with a barely contained rage. His shoulders, normally relaxed, were tense, and his eyes, which had once shared dreams, now sparked with the desperation of a cornered animal. The paperwork between them was a corporate death warrant, the hostile buyout of Richard's shares, the final blow that would consolidate Arthur's empire and erase his partner from the history they had built together. Arthur took a cruel pleasure in it. It was his nature. Trust was for the weak. Loyalty was a currency that always devalued. He had learned that the hard way, and now he was teaching the lesson. "The numbers don't lie, Richard," Arthur said, his voice as calm and sharp as a scalpel. "You got careless, and carelessness in our world is the same as betrayal." Richard shot to his feet, the chair toppling backward with a dull thud. "Betrayal? You talk about betrayal? You who squeezed every drop of my dedication to feed your paranoia. You turned me into a ghost in my own company." The argument, once a venomous whisper, escalated into shouts that echoed through the vast apartment. Driven by a need for air, for space, Arthur walked to the glass doors leading to the terrace, sliding them open to the howling wind and the fine rain that had begun to fall. The grey sky looked ready to collapse on the city. Richard followed him, his face red with choler. "I gave 30 years of my life to this, to you." Richard's words were lashes in the wind. "And you accuse me of stealing? You who stole my soul?" Arthur turned, disdain etched on his face. "Your soul isn't worth the paper this contract is printed on." It was the last straw. In a blind rage, Richard lunged. It wasn't a punch, it was a shove. A violent, desperate thrust, fueled by decades of resentment. Arthur, caught by surprise, staggered back. His expensive shoes slipped on the marble floor that was becoming slick with mist. The world tilted vertiginously. For a split second, he felt the absence of ground beneath his feet, the void calling to him. The scream was trapped in his throat, replaced by a pure, absolute terror. His hands flailed, grasping for anything, and his fingers closed with the strength of a drowning man on the cold metal frame of the terrace railing. His body swung violently over the abyss. Dozens of floors below, the cars were tiny toys. The wind whipped at him, trying to tear him from his only anchor. He looked up and saw Richard's face, distorted by hatred. There was no remorse there, only a grim resolution. Slowly, deliberately, Richard raised his foot and placed it on Arthur's fingers, which were clinging to life by a thread. The pressure began crushing, a crack of bone, the searing pain shooting up his arm. His fingers were giving way. The end was a cold, dizzying certainty. The pain was a blinding white agony, surging from Arthur's crushed fingers and exploding in his brain. Every second hanging there felt like an eternity, the roar of the wind in his ears, drowning out the sound of his own bones breaking under Richard's shoe. The hatred on his ex-partner's face was the last image he would take from this world. He was going to die here, a billionaire reduced to dead weight, eliminated not by a worthy rival, but by a man he considered weak, who now looked down on him with hideous triumph. His strength was draining, the cold mist making the metal slick. His fingers screamed in protest, ready to let go. It was then, amidst the whirlwind of wind and despair, that he saw her, a small, almost ethereal figure appearing on the adjacent service terrace, a space he barely knew existed. It was a little girl, in a simple dress, her dark hair plastered to her face by the rain. She ran, her small, bare feet slapping silently on the wet floor. Her eyes, wide and frightened, were fixed on him. Arthur blinked, certain it was a hallucination, an infantile angel of death come to escort him. But she was real. With an urgency that defied her age, the girl lay down on the terrace floor, her thin body stretched to its limit, and extended a small arm toward him. "Sir, take my hand!" she yelled, her small voice nearly lost in the wind. For a moment, the absurdity of the situation paralyzed him. Then survival instinct took over. With his hand that wasn't being crushed, he reached the muscles in his shoulder. Screaming, his fingers found hers. Her hand was small, delicate, almost fragile, and the moment he grasped it, the brutal reality hit him harder than Richard's shove. She had no strength. She was a child. Her small hand, though firm, could do nothing against the weight of a grown man. A final, cruel irony. His only hope was as helpless as he was. He saw the understanding dawn on her face, too. The initial panic in her eyes gave way to intense frustration and then to something else, a spark of fierce determination. She didn't pull. She didn't try. Instead, she abruptly let him go, shouted, "Wait!" and scrambled to her feet, running to the inner wall of the service terrace. Arthur watched her stop before a small red box, something he had never noticed in all his visits to that floor. With an effort that took her whole body, she pulled a small lever down. And then she turned, filled her small lungs, and screamed with all her might, not at him, but at the hallway below, the one word that would change everything: fire! The next second, a deafening alarm began to blare, an electronic shriek that tore through the air, accompanied by strobe lights that began flashing on the corridor ceiling. The sound was an electric shock. Richard, who had been savoring his moment of victory, froze. His head snapped toward the noise, his face a mask of confusion and fury. That hesitation, that split second of distraction, was all Arthur needed. Fueled by the adrenaline flooding his system and the last ounce of his strength, he swung his body to the side, a desperate pendulum. His crushed fingers screamed, but he ignored them. His free hand shot out, blindly seeking anything solid. His fingers closed around the metal frame of one of the glass windows. The new grip was precarious, but it was a chance. Richard, jolted from his stupor by the movement, looked down, the alarm still wailing like an omen, and saw Arthur's face, now inches from a new hold. He lifted his foot again, this time not to crush but to kick. Richard's kick sliced through the air, but adrenaline gave Arthur an agility he didn't know he possessed. He twisted his body, feeling the tip of his tormentor's expensive shoe scrape painfully against his ribs, but the impact wasn't enough to dislodge him. The shrill shriek of the fire alarm was the soundtrack to Richard's personal hell. The plan, so brutally simple, was unraveling into a chaos of flashing lights and sound. Panic replaced the hatred in his eyes. To stay meant being caught red-handed. He shot one last look of impotent fury at Arthur, a look that promised this wasn't over, and then turned and ran, disappearing through the office door, seconds before the first alarmed voices began to echo down the hall. Arthur was left alone, hanging between life and death, the alarm hammering in his head. The pain in his fingers was now a live coal, a fire consuming his arm. His other hand, clinging to the window frame, was slipping. Every muscle in his body trembled with the superhuman effort not to yield to gravity. For the first time in his adult life, he was completely powerless. His money, his influence, his connections, none of it mattered 70 stories up. He was just flesh and bone, fighting against cold metal and the treacherous wind. The world below was an indifferent tapestry of distant lights. He closed his eyes, the rain mixing with the cold sweat on his face. It was then that the terrace doors burst open. Two security guards, their faces pale with shock, froze at the entrance, paralyzed by the scene. Their gazes went from Arthur to the empty space beside him, and the realization of what had almost happened left them speechless. Behind them, a woman came running. It was the cleaning lady, the girl's mother. Her name was... He didn't know. He had never bothered to know. She let out a choked cry upon seeing him and ran, not to him, but to her daughter, who was still standing near the alarm box, watching everything with an unsettling calm. The woman grabbed the girl, wrapping her in her arms as if to shield her from the entire world. The mother's look toward Arthur was a mixture of terror and accusation. What did his world have to do with her daughter? The guard's hands grabbed him, strong, desperate hands, pulling him over the railing. The feeling of solid floor under his body was like being born again. He collapsed, gasping, the pain in his hand exploding into overwhelming nausea. Paramedics, who had come up with the guards, immediately surrounded him, their voices a distant hum in his ears. An oxygen mask was placed over his face. He felt a prick in his arm, but his mind was elsewhere. Ignoring the pain, he lifted his head, searching through the chaos of legs and equipment. He needed to see her, the girl, his savior. He found her. The mother was holding her tightly by the hand, pulling her away from the scene toward a service elevator. The woman glanced back for a second, and her eyes met Arthur's. In them, he saw no relief or pride. He saw only fear. A deep, visceral fear that made her quicken her pace and disappear with the child behind the closing metal doors. Before he could form a single word, a thank you, a question, they were gone. The little hero and her terrified mother had simply vanished, as if they had never been there. The sterile white of the hospital room was an affront. Arthur hated hospitals. They were places of weakness, of surrender, where bodies were broken and control was handed over to strangers in white coats. He was sitting up in bed, his torso bare under a coarse sheet, his right hand wrapped in a thick bandage that throbbed with a dull, insistent pain. 3 broken fingers and multiple torn ligaments, the doctor had said. Lucky, he added, not to have lost the hand entirely. Lucky. The word sounded like an insult. He had ignored orders to rest, his cell phone pressed to his ear by his shoulder, while his left hand, trembling with rage, tried and failed to button a shirt an assistant had brought. He needed to get out of there, back to his command center, his office, where the world made sense. Every minute in this room was a victory for Richard. I don't care about procedure. I want my legal team here now, he snarled at the unfortunate head of security on the other end of the line. He hung up, throwing the phone onto the bed with a frustrated sigh. The image of the girl wouldn't leave his head. That small, serious face, the resolve in her eyes. And then the fear in the mother's eyes. Why did they run? They had saved him. They should be celebrated, rewarded. Instead, they disappeared like smoke. An hour later, his legal team arrived. Helena, his lead counsel, a middle-aged woman with a gaze as sharp as her mind, and Marcus, her right-hand man. They didn't enter with their usual deference. Their faces were grim, the gravity in their posture a bad omen. Arthur, thank God you're... All right, Helena began, but there was no relief in her voice. There was urgency. Richard is gone. His private jet took off for the Cayman Islands 40 minutes after the incident. A chill ran down Arthur's spine. Find him. Use every resource. I want him extradited and rotting in a cell. Helena exchanged a quick look with Marcus. Arthur, the problem is bigger than we thought. It's not just about the assault. We've spent the last few hours scouring the servers. We believe the fire alarm interrupted him in the middle of his final move. Arthur stared at her, not understanding. Move. He wasn't just trying to eliminate you physically. Helena said, her voice low and firm. He was eliminating you financially. For months, maybe years, Richard has been siphoning funds. Small amounts at first, then millions. We've found a complex network of shell companies and offshore accounts. He was bleeding the company dry from the inside, Arthur, systematically. The air left Arthur's lungs. The pain in his hand seemed to vanish, replaced by a cold void in his stomach. Robbed. He, Arthur Sterling, the man who could smell disloyalty from a mile away, had been robbed blind for years. The humiliation was a poison, more potent than the attempted murder. The physical attack was a crime of passion, almost primitive. But this was an insult to his intelligence, to his legacy, to everything he was. "How much?" he asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. Helena hesitated. "Our initial estimates, they're devastating. He leveraged company assets in ways you never authorized, created ghost debt. Arthur, the truth is, we're on the verge of ruin." The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the monotonous beep of a heart monitor beside the bed. Arthur looked at his bandaged hand, the symbol of his vulnerability. He had been tricked, betrayed, and nearly killed. And now he was broke. A cold fire ignited in his eyes. "Then we destroy him," he said, his voice regaining its steel. "Legally, financially. I want him to have nowhere left to hide." Helena swallowed hard, her expression growing even more concerned. "That's where things get even more complicated, Arthur," she said, opening a folder she had brought. "Richard didn't plan this overnight. He laid the groundwork. For the last 6 months, he's been collecting statements from ex-employees, forging reports, and even paid 2 psychologists to create a dossier. A dossier alleging that you suffer from mental instability, paranoia, and erratic behavior. He was building a case to have you removed from the company on grounds of incapacity, the attack on the terrace. He's going to claim that you attacked him in a psychotic fit and that he merely defended himself." Helena's revelation hung in the sterile air of the room, more suffocating than the lack of ventilation. Arthur felt a wave of nausea. Richard's plan was diabolical in its perfection. It wasn't just a theft, it was a complete annihilation of his identity, his reputation. The victim turned into the aggressor, the financial genius portrayed as a madman. He looked at his own hands, the bandaged one and the trembling one, and for the first time in decades he felt cornered. The spider's web Richard had woven was intricate and sticky, and he was right in the center of it. "That's absurd," he snarled, his voice thick with impotent fury. "No one will believe that. My life is an open book." Helena shook her head slowly, the pity in her eyes infuriating him. "Arthur, he has proof. Testimonies from people you fired, email chains taken out of context, reports signed by professionals. He's painted a picture of an isolated, suspicious man who lives in an ivory tower and sees enemies in every shadow. It's a caricature, but it's a convincing one for a board or a judge who doesn't know you." The bitter truth of her words hit him. His pathological suspicion, his armor, was now being used as the weapon to destroy him. Every door he had closed to the world, every relationship he had sacrificed in the name of security was now a brick in the wall of his own prison. He was alone, and Richard was counting on it. "What about the girl?" The question escaped his lips before he could stop it. "The cleaner's daughter. She saw everything. She's my witness." Marcus, who had remained silent until now, cleared his throat. "We thought of that, Arthur. We've identified the employee. Her name is Clara. The daughter is Lydia, 7 years old. But there's a problem." Arthur leaned forward, the pain in his fingers forgotten. "What problem?" "They've disappeared," Marcus said. "They're not at their apartment. It's empty. A neighbor said Clara left in a hurry with a small bag right after leaving the building, and Arthur, Clara's exit from the company system wasn't a normal departure. She was fired. Arthur's world stopped. Fired? By whom? On what authority? The order came from the Director of Human Resources, Helena explained. The reason on record: gross negligence, endangering the safety of company property and executives. The justification is that she allowed her child to wander into a restricted area during a critical incident. The termination was effective less than an hour after you were taken away by the ambulance. The cruelty of the act left him breathless. It was retaliation, a clear message. Richard's allies were still in the company, acting in the shadows, cleaning up loose ends. They hadn't just silenced his only witness, they had punished her for saving him. The woman, Clara, had lost her job because of him. The girl, Lydia, who had acted with a courage that would put armies to shame, was now a fugitive with her mother, likely terrified. A feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time began to bubble beneath the anger, guilt. He had never noticed that woman. She was part of the furniture, an anonymous face who kept his sanctuary immaculate. And now, she and her daughter were paying the ultimate price for his personal war. "Find them," he ordered, his voice low and dangerous. "Use every resource, private investigators, whatever it takes. I don't care about the cost. I want you to find Clara and Lydia and make sure they're safe." He knew it wasn't just about getting his witness back. It was something deeper. It was a debt, a life debt that he had to repay. As Helena and Marcus left to begin the hunt, Arthur was alone with his thoughts. He remembered the fear in Clara's eyes as she fled. It wasn't fear of him. It was fear of what he represented: power, danger, a violent world that had invaded their lives. And now he realized with a growing dread that fear was justified. What he didn't know was that miles away, in a small motel room on the outskirts of the city, Clara was holding Lydia in her arms, who was shivering not from fear, but from a sudden fever. And on top of a worn-out dresser, a plain brown envelope with no return address contained a single sheet of paper with a message printed in computer letters: "Forget what you saw, for your own good." The thin walls of the motel room seemed to shrink with every passing hour. The smell of mildew and cheap disinfectant clung to the back of Clara's throat. Outside, the city pulsed with a life she was no longer a part of. Inside, the only sound was Lydia's ragged breathing, a faint wheeze that cut Clara's heart with every inhale. The girl's fever rose and fell in waves, leaving her pale and lethargic. The anonymous note was folded in her pocket, burning like a hot coal. Forget. How could she forget the terror on Mr. Sterling's face, the fury on the other man's, the sound of the alarm, the look of pure panic on Lydia's face when she realized she couldn't pull that huge man up? She knew, with a mother's intuition, that the firing was no coincidence. It was a punishment. The note, a sentence. They knew where to find her, and that meant they weren't safe anywhere. Meanwhile, in Arthur's world, the first week after the incident was a descent into a bureaucratic and paranoid hell. Confined. To his penthouse, now guarded by a new security team, he was a caged lion. The news of his supposed mental breakdown had leaked to the financial press, planted with a surgeon's precision. Sterling Corp's stock plummeted. Board members, once subservient, now eyed him with suspicion. He saw Richard's shadow in every unanswered email, every postponed meeting. His days were a blur of video conferences with lawyers and accountants, each conversation revealing a new layer of Richard's betrayal. It was like peeling a rotten onion. The financial humiliation was almost worse than the physical one. He, the Midas, the man who turned everything to gold, now watched his empire crumble under the weight of fraudulent debts and sabotaged contracts. Amidst that storm, the one thing that kept him focused was the search for Clara and Lydia. The PIs he hired were the best, but they hit a wall of silence. Clara seemed to have been swallowed by the city, using only cash, avoiding cameras, moving like a ghost. It was a search for a needle in a haystack, and with each passing day, Arthur's desperation grew. He needed them, not just as witnesses, but as proof that on that terrible day, something good had happened. They were his only anchor in a sea of betrayal. It was on a Thursday night, while reviewing security reports with his new head of security, an ex-military man named Jonas, that something bothered him. The report mentioned 2 unexplained failures in his armored car's brakes in the last 3 months, both attributed to mechanical wear and tear, and an incident 6 months ago on an overseas trip where he had spent 2 days with violent food poisoning after a dinner with potential investors introduced by Richard. "Jonas," Arthur said, his voice low, "I want you to investigate these incidents. Forget what the reports say. Hire independent experts. I want to know if the wear and tear was natural, and I want a list of everyone who was at that dinner." Jonas, a man of few words, just nodded, but the look in his eyes showed he understood the implication. The shove on the terrace wasn't an impulsive act. It was Plan C. The paranoia Richard had used to slander him was, in fact, a survival instinct that had failed to sound the alarm. He had been hunted for months. The realization left him cold. It wasn't just a man. It was a plan. And he had seen nothing. Just then, his personal cell phone rang. Private number. He hesitated, then answered. A distorted, electronically altered voice spoke, looking for someone, Sterling. Arthur's blood ran cold. "Who is this?" "A friend. A friend who knows where the mother and daughter are. A friend who thinks they should stay quiet. And that you should accept your forced retirement for old time's sake." Before Arthur could respond, the line went dead. He stood there, phone in hand, his heart pounding. They weren't just threatening Clara. They were using her as bait, using her against him. And at that moment, in a cheap motel room across town, Lydia, in a brief moment of lucidity between waves of fever, whispered to her mother, "Mommy, the bad man, Mr. Sterling's friend. I saw him before. Lots of times. He talked to Mr. Walter, the computer man. He gave him an envelope, and to the cleaning lady on the other floor." Clara looked at her, thinking the fever might be making her delirious, but Lydia pointed a trembling finger at the television where a financial news show was displaying a picture of Richard. "Not him, Mommy, the other one. The one who always smiled, but his eyes didn't." Arthur's private investigator called 2 days later. "Mr. Sterling, we have a lead. Not on Clara, but on a pattern. A very strange pattern of terminations and transfers. In your company, all linked to one man. Walter, your head of IT, and he seems to have a very close relationship with one of the cleaning supervisors. One who subbed in for the regular cleaner on your floor several times in the past few months. The PI's information was like a beam of light in a dark tunnel. Walter, the head of IT, a harmless-looking man, always hunched over a keyboard whom Arthur barely noticed, and a substitute cleaner, small, seemingly insignificant pieces on the grand chessboard of his company. Richard was the enemy king, but who were the pawns paving the way for checkmate? Lydia's mention of the computer man and the cleaning lady echoed in his mind. A feverish child's perception now sounded like a prophecy. He ordered Jonas and the investigators to focus on Walter and the cleaner, quietly, no fanfare. He wanted to understand the extent of the network before he made a move. While the shadow investigation proceeded, the legal battle intensified. Richard's lawyers, using the forged dossier, filed an emergency petition to remove Arthur from control of the company, citing his dangerous instability. A hearing was set. Arthur's career and reputation would be judged based on skillfully constructed lies. The pressure was immense. He felt like he was fighting ghosts. Every step he took, Richard seemed to have anticipated. it. It was during a sleepless night, sifting through piles of documents in his office, that he found something. An old folder from the back of a file cabinet that hadn't been opened in years. The title was Initial Projects, S&P, Sterling, and Price. Inside were sketches, old business plans, dreams scribbled on napkins, and photos. Photos of them younger, in the garage where it all began. Two young men with more ambition than money, grinning at the camera, the future a bright horizon. A sharp pain, different from the physical ache, hit him. It was the pain of loss, not of money, but of a friendship he had once believed was unshakable. In the back of the folder was a sealed envelope. In his own handwriting it read, "In case of emergency, open only together." He didn't remember it. 30 years was a long time. Curious, he tore open the envelope. Inside, there were no legal documents or secret passwords. There was a single sheet of paper and a small old key. On the paper, a contract they had written themselves in almost childish language. One clause read, "If one of us becomes a money-obsessed tyrant and forgets why we started, the other has the right to invoke the garage clause and force a 48-hour timeout to remember where we came from." It was a pact of youth, naive and forgotten, and the key, he recognized it. It was the key to the old warehouse they had used as their first office, even before the garage, a place that hadn't been visited in decades. An inexplicable impulse took hold of him. It was crazy, a waste of time, but he needed air, a break from this war of attrition. The next morning, without telling anyone, he took a car and drove to the decaying industrial part of the city. The warehouse was there, rusted and covered in ivy. The key with difficulty turned in the lock. The air inside was heavy, smelling of dust and time. Old furniture covered in sheets, boxes stacked high, and in a corner, an old metal safe. A cheap model they had bought at a thrift store. The combination, he racked his brain, his mother's birthday, Richard's mother's birthday. The year they met, the door creaked open. Inside were more photos, a trophy from a local award they had won, and at the back, a small cassette tape recorder. He pressed play. The voice that came out was a young Richard's, laughing, and his own voice, full of a hope he barely recognized, and then something else, a recording he never knew existed. It was a conversation between Richard and his father, years ago. Richard's father's voice was harsh. "You're too soft, son. This Sterling kid will swallow you whole. If you don't learn to be a shark, you'll end up as bait. Sometimes, to protect what's yours, you have to be willing to burn it all down." And Richard's reply, trembling and young, "But we're partners, Dad, friends. Friendship doesn't pay the bills," the old man answered. "Remember that." Arthur turned off the recorder, his heart heavy. The seed of betrayal had been planted a long time ago. He was about to leave when his foot kicked a loose metal box under a table. He pried it open, and what he saw changed everything. These weren't company documents. They were records of payments made by Richard over years to a shell company in the Bahamas. But the beneficiaries weren't him. They were names Arthur didn't recognize. Names of executives at competing companies that had mysteriously gone bankrupt. And on a separate paper, a detailed plan. A plan to acquire a major pharmaceutical company, the company his own father had founded and lost to bankruptcy years before he even met Richard. The lead investor behind Richard's plan was a foreign conglomerate known for hostile takeovers, and the director of that conglomerate was the same man who had dined with him the night he was poisoned. The dusty air of the warehouse seemed to solidify, becoming heavy and hard to breathe. Arthur felt the floor drop out from under him for the second time in as many weeks. This wasn't a simple case of embezzlement or a personal vendetta from a resentful partner. This was something far bigger, older, and infinitely more sinister. Richard's betrayal wasn't just against him, but against his father's memory, against the very foundation of his journey. The pharmaceutical company his father had built with sweat and sacrifice and which he had watched crumble as a teenager, was the real prize. His own company, Sterling Corp, was just the means to an end, the financial engine to fund this acquisition. He had been the tool and now the final obstacle to be removed. The names of the executives from failed companies, the secret payments. Suddenly it all made sense. Richard wasn't just stealing, he was participating in a large-scale industrial sabotage scheme orchestrated by that foreign conglomerate. They didn't buy companies, they broke them from the inside and then picked up the pieces for a fraction of their value. And he, Arthur, had been the unwitting financier of the entire operation. Richard's paranoia, his fear of being swallowed, was a projection. He had become the shark his father had advised him to be. He sat down on an old crate, the ringing in his ears louder than the warehouse's silence. The attack on the terrace, the forged reports, the smear campaign, it all fit into a cold, calculated strategy to seize total control of Sterling Corp's resources and make the final move on the pharmaceutical acquisition. His elimination was an operational necessity. He closed the metal box, his heart hammering. Against his ribs, he now had the proof, not just of Richard's betrayal, but of an international conspiracy. But how to use it? The hearing about his sanity was approaching. Presenting this evidence suddenly could seem like another paranoid delusion from a desperate man. He needed more. He needed a living witness, someone who could connect the dots. He needed Clara and Lydia. Returning to his penthouse, he found Jonas waiting for him, his face grimmer than usual. "Bad news, sir," Jonas said without preamble. "The mother and daughter, they've started receiving direct threats. We found a second note left at the door of their new hiding place. Our men didn't see them, but a neighbor told us. The message was more explicit this time. Stop making up stories or the girl will have an accident at school." Arthur felt the rage rise like bile. They were using a child as a weapon. The cruelty of the act solidified his resolve. This wasn't about business anymore, it was about justice. "And Walter, the IT guy?" Arthur asked, his voice icy. "He's acting strange," Jonas reported. "Made a large cash withdrawal, and we found records of frequent calls to an untraceable number in the Cayman Islands, same location Richard's jet flew to." The web was becoming clearer, the threads connecting Richard, the foreign conglomerate, and the traitors within his own company. They were cornering Clara, terrorizing her to ensure her silence. The firing, the threats, all designed to isolate and discredit her if she ever decided to talk. The next day, a new twist emerged. Helena, his lawyer, called, her voice tense. "Arthur, Richard's lawyers just filed a new motion. It's a petition for guardianship, not just over the company, but over your personal assets. They're claiming your condition makes you unfit to manage your own finances, and they have a judge who seems very sympathetic to their cause." The audacity of the move stunned him. They didn't just want the company. They wanted everything, to leave him without resources, without power, completely at their mercy. He felt like he was sinking in quicksand. For every move he made, they countered with two, always a step ahead. The legal battle seemed lost before it even began. That night, exhausted and disheartened, he stared out his penthouse window. The city glittered below, indifferent. He felt more alone than ever. It was then that his personal cell, the one he used for non-business matters, vibrated, a message from an unknown number. There was no text, just an image. It was a drawing, a child's drawing done in colored pencil. It showed a big man on top of a building and a bad man pushing him, and a little girl in a red dress pulling a fire alarm lever. Below the drawing, a sentence written in the hesitant script of a child. "I saw. I remember." Beneath the sentence, there was a small detail that almost went unnoticed. In the corner of the drawing, the girl had drawn a little logo, the logo of a cheap fast food chain known for its playgrounds. It was a message, a clue. Lydia was telling him where she was, in the only way she knew how. The child's drawing was more eloquent than any legal document. It was an act of courage, in the form of art, a coded message from an unlikely ally. The fast food chain's logo, a smiling sun in a chef's hat, was burned into Arthur's mind. It was a popular chain, with dozens of locations scattered throughout the city and its suburbs. The clue was a start, but the haystack was still immense. He immediately sent the image to Jonas and his team. Scrap everything else. This is the priority. Check every single location of this chain. Look for a woman and a girl matching their descriptions. Be discreet. We can't afford to scare them. As the search unfolded, the pressure on Arthur mounted. The media, fed by anonymous leaks, published articles about the eccentric recluse and his mental battle. His minority partners, once loyal, began to waver, pressured by the board and the plummeting stock value. He was losing control of his own narrative. The second week after the incident dragged on, each day bringing a new battlefront. His lawyers fought to delay the guardianship hearing, but the system seemed tilted in Richard's favor. It was like punching smoke. He felt increasingly isolated in his golden tower, which now felt more like a prison. The nights were the worst. He relived the fall, the wind, Richard's face. But now the image was mixed with Lydia's drawing. Her courage shamed him. A 7-year-old girl was risking everything to tell the truth, while he, with all his resources, was being systematically dismantled. One night, as he stared at the drawing, on his phone, something else caught his eye. Besides the logo, there was another small detail in the opposite corner. A small blue bus, drawn with care, and next to the bus, the number 47. It was another clue, a bus line, a cross-reference, a location for that chain on the 47 bus route. The search now had a much sharper focus. In less than an hour, Jonas called. "We found it. There's a single location that fits. It's in a working-class neighborhood in Queens. The 47 bus stops right in front. My men are on their way. What are your orders?" Arthur's instinct screamed for him to go himself, but he knew his presence would create a spectacle and could put them in more danger. "Do not approach, just observe, confirm it's them, ensure they're safe from a distance. I don't want them to know they're being watched. The last thing we need is for them to run from us, too." Hours later, the confirmation came. It was a grainy video shot on a cell phone from afar. It showed Clara and Lydia sitting at a booth by the window. Lydia was eating fries, looking healthier. Clara, however, looked exhausted. Her shoulders slumped with the weight of the world, constantly glancing at the door, at the street, like a frightened animal. Seeing them there, so vulnerable, ignited a protective fury in Arthur. He had to reach them, but how? A direct approach would terrify them. Sending a lawyer would feel like a summons. It was then that he had an idea. He wouldn't send a suit. He would send someone who spoke Clara's language, someone who understood fear and precarity. He thought of Helena, his lawyer, but she was part of his world. Then he remembered a former employee, a woman named Iris, who had been a housekeeper at the company for 40 years and had retired the previous year. She knew Clara. She had a gentle way about her, a wisdom that came from a life of hard work. He contacted her. He explained the situation, the delicacy, the need to build trust. Iris, with her unshakable calm, accepted immediately. The next day, a white-haired woman with a kind smile walked into the fast food restaurant. She didn't go directly to Clara's table. She ordered a coffee, sat nearby, and after a few minutes, accidentally dropped her purse. When Clara bent down to help, their eyes met. "Clara, my dear, is that you? What are you doing out here?" The relief on Clara's face at seeing a familiar, friendly face was instant. They talked. Iris didn't mention Arthur. She spoke of life, of hardships, of how good people sometimes find themselves in bad situations. And then, gently, she handed Clara a burner phone. "A friend of mine asked me to give this to you. She said you might need help and that this phone is safe. No one can track it." That night, the phone Iris had given Arthur rang. It was Clara. Her voice was a whisper, filled with fear and suspicion. "What do you want from us?" "I want to help," Arthur said, his own voice softer than he expected. "I know you're in danger because of me. I want to protect you, and I need your help. Lydia, she's the only one who can tell the truth." There was a long silence. He could hear Clara's breathing on the other end. "They'll hurt us," she said, her voice cracking. "They'll hurt my daughter." "I won't let them," Arthur promised, with a conviction that came from the depths of his soul. "But for that to happen, I need you to tell me everything. Everything Lydia saw, every detail. Because your daughter's perception might be the key to bringing down not just one man, but an entire organization that has been hunting me for months." The conversation with Clara was a turning point. For the first time, Arthur felt he was no longer fighting alone. Her voice, though trembling, carried the strength of a lioness protecting her cub. For hours, over several calls on that secure phone, Clara relayed Lydia's observations. They were fragments, pieces of a puzzle seen through the eyes of a child who, by being invisible to the adults around her, saw and heard everything. Lydia, with her photographic memory, recalled whispered conversations in hallways, tense faces, in impromptu meetings, documents left on desks. She described Walter, the IT guy, handing a flash drive to an unknown messenger in the parking garage. She described the substitute cleaner photographing documents on Arthur's desk with her cell phone when she thought no one was looking. She even described a tense meeting between Richard and a harsh-speaking foreign man, in which she overheard the words "break failure" and "disappointment." Every detail Lydia remembered was a piece that fit perfectly into the puzzle Arthur and his team were assembling. The girl's innocent observations were, in fact, a devastating eyewitness account of the conspiracy. Arthur realized with a chill that Lydia's life wasn't just in danger because she witnessed the incident on the terrace. She was in danger because she was the only person who could connect all the dots of the criminal network. This transformed her from a witness to the primary threat. The priority shifted from finding the truth to protecting the source of the truth. He moved Clara and Lydia to a secure location, an isolated country house belonging to a trusted friend, under the constant protection of Jonas and his most loyal team. Far from the city's prying eyes, Lydia, feeling safe for the first time in weeks, began to blossom. She drew tirelessly, no longer scenes of terror, but the faces and events she remembered. Her drawings became a visual diary of the conspiracy. Meanwhile, the legal battle reached a critical point. The guardianship hearing was set, and the assigned judge, a man known for his rigidity and political connections, seemed unmoved by the arguments of Arthur's lawyers. Richard's strategy was working perfectly. The judicial system, meant to be a pillar of justice, was being manipulated. Helena, in an emergency meeting, delivered the devastating news. "Arthur, it's worse than we thought. The judge, we found evidence of large deposits into his account from an investment fund linked to the same foreign conglomerate. The police, the detective in charge of your case, was suddenly transferred and replaced by someone who has buried the attempted murder investigation, classifying it as a dispute between partners with no conclusive evidence. They're not just manipulating the system, they've bought it. The hope of a resolution through official channels disintegrated. They were completely surrounded. The law, the police, the media, everything was being used against him." Arthur felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. He had the truth, he had the proof, he had the witness, but what good was it if the referee was on the enemy's side? That night, at the country house, Arthur watched Lydia playing in the garden. She ran after butterflies, her laughter echoing in the country air. For the first time, he saw her not just as a witness or a hero, but as a child whose innocence was being threatened by a cynical, cruel world. Clara approached him, holding a cup of tea. "She doesn't understand the full scope of it," Clara said, her voice soft. "She just knows she saw something wrong and that you're the good guy in the story." Arthur looked at Clara, at the quiet strength in her face. "She's braver than I'll ever be. She trusts you," Clara said. "She believes you're going to fix things." Those words hit him with the force of a punch. A child's trust was now his greatest responsibility. He could not fail. Not for his company, not for his money, but for her. It was then that a new strategy began to form in his mind. If the system was corrupt, he couldn't fight within it. He would have to create his own courtroom, the court of public opinion. But how? The media was against him. Anything he said would be twisted and used as proof of his instability. He needed something undeniable, something that would bypass the gatekeepers of information and speak directly to the people. His gaze fell on the security camera Jonas had installed on a tree. A daring, dangerous, and perhaps suicidal idea began to take shape. An idea that would put Lydia center stage, but might be the only way to blow the entire scheme wide open. He turned to Jonas. "I want you to set up a live stream. From here, no filters, no editing. And I want you to send the link to every journalist, blogger, and digital influencer in the country 30 seconds before we go live." Jonas stared at him, shocked. "Sir, that's incredibly risky. They can trace us. And putting the girl in front of a camera, it's our only shot," Arthur interrupted. "They control the rules of the game. So, we're going to flip the board." He knew the criminal network would do anything to stop him. They would try to silence him and Lydia forever. The final showdown wouldn't be in a courtroom, but here, in this isolated garden, and it was about to begin. The plan was audacious, bordering on insane. For the next 2 days, the quiet country house was transformed into a tense command center. Jonas and his team, using encryption and signal routing technology, prepared the infrastructure for the live stream, creating a digital maze to make tracing it nearly impossible, at least for a limited time. Arthur, meanwhile, prepared for the most important role of his life. He would not be the arrogant billionaire or the helpless victim. He would be the narrator of a story, the voice that would give context to a little girl's courage. The hardest part was talking to Clara and Lydia. He sat with them in the garden, the afternoon sun turning the grass to gold. "Lydia," he began, his voice gentle, "do you remember what you saw that day and the other? Days about the bad men?" Lydia nodded, her large, serious eyes fixed on him. "I remember everything." "I need you to tell that story to a lot of people," Arthur continued, "so that everyone knows the truth and they can't hurt anyone anymore. But it will be on a camera and many people will be watching. Do you think you can do that?" Clara held her daughter's hand, her face tense with worry. But Lydia looked at Arthur with unshakable trust. "I'm not scared," she said, with a simplicity that disarmed everyone. "You'll be with me." On the night of the broadcast, the tension was palpable. Arthur's guardianship hearing was scheduled for the next morning. It was now or never. Arthur sat in an armchair with Lydia beside him on a small stool, holding one of her drawings. Clara stood just off camera, her gaze fixed on her daughter. Jonas's countdown sounded in his ear through an earpiece. 5, 4, 3. The red light on the camera blinked on. They were live. Arthur looked directly into the lens. "My name is Arthur Sterling. For the past several days, you have read many things about me, that I am unstable, paranoid, insane. Tonight, you are going to hear the truth, but not from me. You are going to hear it from a 7-year-old hero who society deems invisible, but whose eyes saw what no one else did. He then turned to Lydia. With surprising calm, guided by Arthur's gentle questions, Lydia began to tell her story. She didn't speak like a coached witness. She spoke like a child, describing the events with a clarity and innocence that were impossible to manufacture. She held her drawings up to the camera, explaining each one. The drawing of the man being pushed, the drawing of Walter with the flash drive, the drawing of the cleaning lady with the cell phone, the drawing of the foreign man yelling about break, failure. It was an irrefutable testimony coming from the purest source. As the broadcast continued, the digital world exploded. Journalists, initially skeptical, were mesmerized. Social media was on fire. The hashtag #DanceJustIBelieveLydia began to trend worldwide, but they knew the enemy was watching too, and they would react. Jonas's voice cut in through his earpiece. "Sir, they're trying to trace us. They're using brute force. We have maybe 10 more minutes, and we have movement. 3 unmarked cars approaching fast on the access road." The confrontation was coming. Arthur remained calm. "Lydia, sweetie, you have one more thing to tell, don't you? About what you heard the foreign man say about my father's company." "Father's company?" Lydia nodded, and with stunning clarity, she repeated the phrase she had overheard, the phrase that outlined the final plan for the pharmaceutical acquisition. It was the final nail in the conspiracy's coffin. "Jonas, prep for evac, now," Arthur said into his mic before turning back to the camera. "The truth has been told. Now, it's up to you to decide who to believe." He ended the broadcast. The chaos began. Jonas and his men scrambled to get Clara and Lydia to an armored vehicle hidden out back. Arthur grabbed the metal box with the documents from the warehouse. The sound of tires screeching on gravel echoed from outside. They were professionals. Instead of a frontal assault, they had blocked the only exit, and to everyone's horror, a small drone rose above the house, hovering like a deadly insect. Attached to it was not a weapon, but a canister with a spray nozzle. "Gas!" Jonas yelled. "They're going to incapacitate us and fake an accident. Gas leak, a fire, everyone dead." They were trapped. Escape was impossible. The house would become their tomb. Arthur looked at Lydia, who was clinging to her mother's leg, her face pale with fear. He had failed. He had brought them here only to be eliminated together. It was then that Lydia, amidst the panic, pointed at the living room floor. "The cellar," she whispered. "The little door in the closet, like at Grandma's house." Clara and Arthur exchanged a look. They knew of no cellar. But Lydia, in her childish exploration of the house, had found a forgotten trapdoor under a rug inside a broom closet. It was an old, damp, dark wine cellar. Jonas and his men broke open the trapdoor. It was their only chance. They scrambled down into the musty darkness, pulling the hatch closed above them just seconds before they heard the sound of a window shattering and the hiss of gas filling the room. Down below, in the dark, the whirring of the drone hovering. Above them was the only thing they could hear. They were alive but trapped. Time was running out. And outside, the criminals, believing their targets were unconscious, prepared to deliver the final blow and erase all the evidence. The darkness of the cellar was absolute, thick with the smell of damp earth and forgotten wine. The only sound, besides their ragged breathing, was the sinister hum of the drone hovering over the house, a technological vulture waiting for its prey. Above them, heavy footsteps echoed on the wooden floorboards. They were inside. Lydia trembled in Clara's arms, not from the cold, but from the fear that had finally caught up to her. Arthur felt a surge of protective fury. They were not going to end here. "Jonas, status?" he whispered. "We're boxed in, sir. They're upstairs, probably waiting for the gas to take full effect before they start the fire. The cellar has a small ventilation window near the ceiling, but it's barred and too small for us to fit through," Jonas replied, his voice a controlled murmur. The hope the cellar's discovery had given them was fading fast. It was merely a postponement of the inevitable. Arthur ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing for a way out, a flaw in the enemy's plan. The broadcast. They had exposed the truth, but it had only accelerated the elimination attempt. He looked at the metal box he was holding, the physical proof that corroborated Lydia's story. What good was it if it was about to turn to ash along with them? It was Lydia who broke the silence. "The phone," she whispered, pointing to Arthur's pocket. "The nice lady's phone. Iris, the burner phone." Arthur pulled it out. There was a single bar of signal, faint and intermittent. A voice call was impossible, but maybe a text message. One last, desperate message. To whom? The police were compromised. His lawyers were helpless. Then he remembered a name. An investigative journalist from a small independent blog, known for his tenacity and his disdain for large media conglomerates. Arthur had contacted him once, years ago, to leak information about a competitor. The man was a lone wolf, but he was honest. With trembling fingers, Arthur typed a message. Broadcast was real, trapped, isolated country house. They're going to burn us. Trace the live stream's origin. Help. He attached a single photo, the document proving Richard's connection to the foreign conglomerate. He hit send. The message just sat there on the screen, the sending icon spinning. The signal was too weak. It wasn't going through. Above, they heard the sound of liquid being sloshed around. Gasoline! The smell began to seep through the cracks in the floorboards. Their time was up. Arthur closed his eyes, pulling Clara and Lydia close. He had failed. It was then that Jonas, who was near the small ventilation window, said, "Sir, the drone. It's lowered. It's hovering right in front of the grate." The humming was louder now, almost deafening. Why would they do that? Was it a final act of psychological torture? Arthur moved to the window. Through the bars, he could see the night, the trees, and the flying machine with its blinking red light. And then he saw something else. The drone wasn't a military model. It was a modified commercial drone, the kind that used a local Wi-Fi network to communicate with its operator. Arthur's heart leaped. "Jonas, your laptop. Do you have any network hacking software on it?" Jonas stared at him, understanding dawning in his eyes. "I have some basic tools. It might work." It was a 1-in-a-million shot. As Jonas opened his laptop, its battery dangerously low, the smell of gasoline intensified. They could hear the men outside, their muffled voices as they prepared to light the fire. The sending icon on Arthur's phone was still spinning. Failure. Jonas typed furiously. The air in the cellar was growing thin. "I'm in. I'm on the drones. Network! It's a weak, unencrypted connection. Amateurs!" he exclaimed in a triumphant whisper. "What do I do?" Arthur's mind worked feverishly. "The drone has a camera. Feed me its point of view. And where's the operator?" "About 100 yards out near the road. I can see his silhouette on thermal imaging," Jonas said. "And he's streaming the footage to someone. I can see the destination. IP address? It's a server in the Cayman Islands." Richard was watching the live elimination of his witnesses. A cold smile formed on Arthur's face. "Perfect. Jonas, grab the drone's camera feed, the image of the operator, and the destination IP. Send it all to my phone." In seconds, Arthur's phone buzzed as it received a file. He attached it to his desperate text message, and then he had a final idea. "Jonas, the drone has a return to home command, doesn't it?" "Yes, sir." "Activate it. Now." Outside, the Drone operator, a nameless goon, watched in horror as his machine stopped responding to his commands, turned and flew at high speed directly toward him. He dropped the controls and ran, but it was too late. The drone, still with some gas in its sprayer, clipped a tree near him, sending out a shower of sparks, and the gasoline the other goons had poured around the house, along with a spare can, left near the road, had created a volatile trail. The spark was enough. A small flame erupted and raced along the gasoline trail like a fuse, heading straight for the house. But at that same moment, in the cellar, Arthur's phone pinged. The message, boosted by the brief moment the drone got closer to the house before returning, had finally found enough signal. Sent. The fiery explosion that engulfed the house was not what the criminals had planned. Instead of a controlled burn, the extra gas can cause a flashover that caught everyone by surprise, creating an inferno of flame and smoke. And in the distance, the sound of sirens began to pierce the night. The journalist, receiving the message and the video proof, hadn't called the corrupt local police. He had called the fire department and every competing news desk in the city. The game had been spectacularly flipped. The roar of the fire above was a ravenous monster, devouring the house that had briefly been a sanctuary. The heat seeped through the floorboards, and smoke began to leak into the cellar, making the air increasingly unbreathable. The sirens, once a distant sound of hope, were now a race against time. Jonas used the butt of his gun to smash at the grate on the ventilation window, but the old metal, though rusted, held firm. Every second felt like an eternity. Arthur held Lydia, who was coughing into his shoulder, her small face smudged with soot. He looked at Clara, whose expression of terror mirrored his own. To have survived the assassins only to perish in the fire would be the cruelest irony. That's when they heard a sound other than the crackling flames, a sound of tearing metal. One of Jonas's men, a quiet giant, had managed with sheer brute force to wrench the grate from the wall. A gust of fresh, albeit smoky air flooded the cellar. It was a small opening, but it was a way out. One by one, they squeezed through the window, tumbling onto the dirt outside, just feet from the flames licking the night sky. The scene that greeted them was surreal. Fire trucks and federal police cruisers, not the corrupt local force, were surrounding the property. The journalist, a wiry, agitated-looking man, was there, shouting into his phone, coordinating a media firestorm. Richard's goons, caught off guard by the arrival of the authorities and the out-of-control blaze, were quickly subdued and arrested. Arthur and Lydia's live stream, followed by the text with its irrefutable proof and the drone footage, had created an avalanche that not even the conglomerate's money could stop. Public opinion had exploded. The story was no longer about a billionaire's sanity. It was about an international conspiracy and a little girl's courage. Arthur's guardianship hearing, scheduled for that morning, was cancelled. In its place, arrest warrants were issued. For Richard Price, for Walter, the head of IT, for the substitute cleaner, for the executives of the foreign conglomerate. The spider's web, exposed to the light, began to disintegrate. In the weeks that followed, Arthur's world shifted from a battlefield to a boardroom. With the evidence he and Lydia had provided, the recovery of his company was swift and brutal. The board members who had wavered now scrambled to pledge their loyalty. The frozen assets of Richard and the conglomerate were used to repair the financial damage. Sterling Corp, wounded but not defeated, began to rise again. But for Arthur, the business victory felt hollow. The real work was happening far from the skyscrapers. He used his resources to ensure Clara and Lydia had everything they needed. He bought them a comfortable house in a quiet neighborhood with a large backyard. He hired the best tutors for Lydia, who proved to be a brilliant student. Her curiosity and intelligence finally nurtured in a safe environment. He spent his afternoons with them, not as a distant benefactor, but as part of the family. He taught Lydia how to play chess, a game he once saw as a metaphor for corporate warfare, but now saw as an exercise in logic and creativity. He read stories to her before bed. He had quiet conversations with Clara on the porch, learning about her life, her dreams, her resilience. In return, they healed him. Lydia's laughter was the antidote to his paranoia. Clara's quiet dignity untied the knots of his suspicion. He realized that his entire life he had built walls to protect himself, but those walls had also imprisoned him in loneliness. Clara and Lydia, with their simple presence, demolished those walls brick by brick. One day, as Lydia showed him a new drawing, this time a portrait of the three of them smiling under a bright sun, Arthur made a decision. It was not a business decision based on logic and profit. It was a decision from the heart. He went to his lawyers and started a process. Not a lawsuit to recover more money or punish more enemies, but an adoption. He wanted Lydia to be his daughter, legally and officially. He wanted Clara to be his partner, his family. When he asked them on a rainy afternoon, not at the top of a skyscraper, but in the cozy kitchen of their new home, there was no hesitation. The tears in Clara's eyes were not from fear, but from joy. And Lydia's hug was the signature on the most important contract of his life. Justice ran its course. Richard was eventually tracked to a country with no extradition treaty, but he lived the rest of his life as a fugitive, always looking over his shoulder. The paranoia he had projected onto Arthur, now his own constant companion. The conglomerate was hit with international investigations and heavy sanctions, its reputation in tatters. The truth, carried by the voice of a child, had won. But for Arthur, the real resolution wasn't found in courtrooms or headlines. It was in the sound of Lydia's laughter echoing through the garden, in the quiet conversation with Clara at the end of the day, in the sense of belonging he never knew he had been searching for. He had reclaimed his empire, but he discovered that his greatest wealth wasn't in his vaults, but in his living room. 6 weeks after the stormy afternoon that nearly cost him everything, Arthur Sterling stood on the same terrace. But the space was unrecognizable. The cold marble and austere metal frames that once screamed power and isolation had been replaced. It was now a rooftop garden, an oasis of life and color floating above the concrete jungle of New York City. Wooden planters filled with lavender, rosemary, and small daisies scented the air. A jasmine vine was beginning to climb a trellis, its white blossoms like promises. In the center, where an intimidating meeting table once stood, there was now a wooden swing and a small table with comfortable chairs, shaded by an umbrella. The space that had been the stage for betrayal and near death was now a symbol of rebirth and safety. The wind that once lashed at him now blew gently, carrying with it the most precious sound in the world: Lydia's laugh. She was sitting on a soft rug on the floor, surrounded by books and colored pencils, seriously explaining the complexities of photosynthesis, a topic that fascinated her with her new tutor, to a teddy bear. Clara came to Arthur's side, handing him a cup of coffee. She no longer wore a cleaner's uniform, but a simple, elegant dress that highlighted her serene beauty. Her eyes held no more fear, only a quiet love and a strength he had come to admire deeply. "She loves it up here," Clara said, gazing at her daughter. "She says it's the closest place to the stars." Arthur smiled, a genuine smile that came easily now. "She is our star." They stood in silence for a moment, watching Lydia. The transformation in their lives was complete. Arthur hadn't just recovered his company, he had reinvented it. Sterling Corp now had one of the most robust social responsibility programs in the country, focused on childhood education and support for low-income families. He had learned that true power wasn't in dominating, but in elevating. The suspicion that had been his armor was replaced by a wiser discernment, an ability to see the value in people, not their potential flaws. He discovered that loyalty couldn't be bought or forced. It was earned through respect and genuine love. The biggest change, however, was internal. The void he had tried to fill with buildings, numbers, and acquisitions had been filled by the warmth of a family. He was no longer the reclusive billionaire. He was Arthur. He was a father. He was a partner. Lydia got up and ran to him, hugging his legs. She looked up, her eyes shining with intelligence and joy. "Dad, did you know that an ant can carry 50 times its own weight?" Arthur knelt to her level, his heart swelling with a love so vast it almost hurt. "I didn't know that, my little giant, but I do know that real strength, the kind that truly matters, isn't measured in weight or muscle." He looked into her eyes, the same eyes that had met his with fierce determination as he hung from the edge of the abyss. "Real strength is here," he said, gently tapping her forehead. "And here," he added, placing his hand over her heart, "it's courage, intelligence, and a pure heart. Qualities that money can't buy, but that can save lives and change the world." Lydia smiled, understanding the depth of his words in a way only she could. She hugged him tight, a hug worth more than his entire former empire. On that terrace, where a life had almost ended, a new one began every day. The story of Arthur Sterling would no longer be remembered as that of a ruthless billionaire, but as that of a man who was saved, in every sense of the word, by the daughter. Life had given him in the most unexpected way. He had learned the most valuable lesson of all, that sometimes salvation comes from the most unlikely sources, and that the strength no one sees, the moral force of a child, can be powerful enough to topple empires of crime and build a new world based on love.